evening. Thank you all for joining us tonight. So as she said, I'm Kai Wright, and you are here for the launch of The Stakes. It's a new show about social change. Our first episode is going to drop at 4 a.m. tomorrow morning, and later we're going to play the trailer, and I'm going to give you a hard sell about subscribing right here and now. But first, we're going to have a conversation. This is a show about, like I said, social change, but our real driving questions, or it just feels like this is a moment in time in which everything is at its breaking point, and for good and for bad, we are asking all new questions about what kind of society we want to have. And so we are constantly asking in this podcast, how did we get here? How did we get to this moment? And where are we going to go next? And a great place to start that, we figured, was a conversation about law and order, given some of the things that are in the news at the moment, and about our institutions and whether they can save us. And so, for that purpose, we're going to sit down with the 82nd Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder Jr. Please help join me in welcoming Eric Holder to the stage.
I wasn't sure I could move this, come out here and
We got people for that.
First thing I come out here and break something,
Well, first off, welcome home. You're a New York native.
There you go. Born in the Bronx, raised in Queens.
Raised in Queens. Shout out to the Queens
in Manhattan.
folks.
There we go.
Well, we have just a few things to talk about.
There have been some newsworthy
things, and as a consequence, we're going to get right into it.
Let's do it.
The report, special counsel's report.
I've heard about that.
You've heard about this.
Yeah.
Let's first try to just sort of deal with the two big findings. Mm-hmm. Well, the finding and the lack of finding, and just get your immediate take on those. And let's start with this question of not collusion, but criminal conspiracy.
Yeah.
As Special Counsel Mueller laid out, collusion is not a legal question. Criminal conspiracy was the question, whether or not there's evidence of coordination. Mm-hmm. And they could not find that evidence.
Right.
And so my question for you is, before you had read the report, when you had just read the summary of the report, you said that you agree with that finding. It seemed like that's the conversation on conspiracy. Mm-hmm. You've now read the report, presumably.
Well, not all of it. I've not gotten through all 400 pages of it, but a pretty substantial amount of it.
Enough.
Mm-hmm.
So do you still think that this concludes the conversation about conspiracy?
Well, I think the conclusion that they have reached so far is an appropriate one, but I don't think the conversation is over yet, in the sense that you had the Russians clearly trying to interfere in our elections and doing so successfully. You had the Trump campaign trying to use information that the Russians put out there for their benefit. There's just not a connection here. And the connection could exist in Paul Manafort, who at least up to now, as best I can tell, has not cooperated fully. It looks like he's prepared to go to jail for an extended period of time. But jail sometimes tends to change people's minds. And it may be that at some point he could provide that link. But on the basis of what we have so far, I think that the conclusion that the special counsel reached was an appropriate one.
That there is no criminal conspiracy.
Yeah, and I got to tell you, I'm a little surprised by that. Just having followed it in the news, I thought that there was going to be a finding that, in fact, there had been inappropriate contact between the campaign and the Russians.
Well, that's my question. So why isn't that? I mean, the report very clearly spells out the ways in which there was inappropriate contact and the ways in which the campaign may not have conspired to... may have not conspired in the first instance, but certainly sought to benefit from illegal behavior. So why isn't that a crime?
Well, you got collusion, I think, there, in the sense that you got, as I said, the attack, the use of the information on the basis of the attack, but not necessarily an agreement. between the two sides, and that is the thing that you need in order to prove the conspiracy. And people have talked, I think, for too long. I kept saying, we're not looking for collusion. We're looking for a conspiracy, and there's a big difference between colluding and a criminal conspiracy.
But isn't help us for those of us who are not legal experts, help us understand why it is not criminal to have to seek to benefit from this criminal activity that the report does lay out.
If you were not a person who participated in the obtaining of the information inappropriately, if information was just out there that you made use of, it is not something that I think any campaign should be doing. I saw Rudy Giuliani on, I guess, the television yesterday and saying, essentially it seemed to be saying, if you get information from the Russians inappropriately obtained, well, why wouldn't we use it? It's kind of like, really? Are you serious? Because it's not the kind of thing that you would expect from a person or a campaign for the presidency. In fact, you would think that your instinctive reaction would be to go to the authorities, go to the FBI, and say, "We've come into possession of this information. This is something that you all, need to look at." Now, having said all that, to charge a campaign with criminal conspiracy, you've got to show that there was an agreement and that there was, a cohesive attempt to not only to obtain but to use the information. I just don't think you're we're there yet.
But you hope or not, but you suspect there's a road there with Paul Manafort.
I think the possibility exists. At this point, it seems kind of, I don't think just serendipitous, that the Russians just happened to be doing this on behalf of the candidate who they wanted to happen to win, and the campaign just happened to, fall into this information, and Trump just happened to say, "Russians, if you're listening to me." There's a lot of really, stuff there that just needs a read of something to connect it to, and I think Manafort is potentially that person.
So then, what about moving to obstruction?
Mm-hmm. That's a whole different deal.
It's a whole different deal. The report now famously says, quote, "If we had confidence after a thorough investigation of the facts that the president clearly did not commit obstruction of justice, we would so state." They did not so
and
state.
They did not, right.
But
which is huge. People need to understand the significance of that. If we could say that the president of the United States was not guilty, we would have said that. We can't say that the president of the United States is not guilty. That is a huge, huge thing. That's a huge thing.
Well, but in the course of this, and we'll talk about, I want to just sit Bob Barr to the side for a second, but thinking about Robert Mueller and how he handled this, mm-hmm. There's a lot of frustration, and I wanted to sort of get your reaction to this, that the report is saying, I cannot tell you whether or not there was obstruction. I'm going to defer to this Justice Department guidance, right. on whether or not whether a sitting president can be indicted. So I'm not going to come to a conclusion on obstruction. But here's a whole bunch of evidence of obstruction, mm-hmm. which feels like a very unsatisfying conclusion, both politically and legally. Do you think he handled it correctly?
Yeah, I think that he did, given the Justice Department strictures under which he operated, that did not allow him to bring charges against the president. All that Bob Mueller was capable of doing was either clearing the president, saying he's not guilty, or doing what he did. Now, he didn't find, he couldn't indict, but he also did not find that the president was exonerated, using that term. This is all based on those two Office of Legal Counsel opinions, one from 1973, one from 2000, both of which I've read, both of which I disagree with.
Was he too deferential to those?
No, he wasn't too deferential. He is, under the regulations, he is an employee of the Justice Department. When we wrote those regulations, we decided that we wanted to have special counsels follow the rules of the Justice Department, as opposed to the independent counsels under the prior statute, where you had them doing all kinds of really weird and bizarre stuff. And so, as a result, he is precluded from indicting a sitting president on the basis of those OLC opinions, which essentially say that if you indict the president, it would have a paralyzing impact on the executive branch. And one of the reasons I disagree with that is that, well, this president apparently got a lot of executive time, so he could fill in some of that time. He could fill in some of that time dealing with his criminal case. But aside from that, I think it underestimates the ability of the executive branch to continue to function, even if the president were to have to deal with a criminal case. There's also the 25th Amendment, where the president could, in essence, give to the vice president the presidential responsibilities. And I think also they underestimate the paralyzing impact of that which they say is cognizable, which is the possibility of impeachment. That is something that would be would paralyze the president, under the way in which they've analyzed the various statutes.
There's all kinds of things that could paralyze the president.
Sure. And but presidents. I mean, Bill Clinton was impeached, but he's famous for compartmentalizing, and he continued to do a whole variety of things, as president. As I said, this president's got a lot of time apparently that he could fill with, focusing on a criminal charge. But I think that the thing it is unsatisfying, because I think the Mueller report lays out, as I said, I think in a tweet a couple of days or so ago, a pretty clear case. You almost see the indictment, United States versus Donald Trump, and you could see the specifications of obstruction that would be there, and yet because of this OLC opinion, you can't do anything about it. The OLC opinion envisions that you would have Congress doing its constitutional duty, would impeach a president, and then that president would be subjected to criminal prosecution.
So then is that the purpose? I mean, trying to put ourselves in Robert Mueller's shoes here, is that the purpose of writing this report this way? Is it because it's frustrating to say, well, we can't reach a conclusion, but here's all the evidence of the conclusion we could have reached?
Oh, yeah.
What is the reason to write a report that way? How is that useful?
I think he's written a guideline for a congressional examination of this conduct. The way he has on the obstruction side, the different specifications, the proof that is there. He even makes reference to, specific documents, pages within documents. It's almost there for Congress to just take and use that as the basis for, if not action immediately, certainly as a basis for investigation that might lead to action.
And so do you think that the Democratic House should be pushing for impeachment?
Well, I certainly think that we Democrats have been railing, and I think legitimately so, about Republicans not doing their constitutional duty and to have appropriate oversight of this president. They've been complicit in what this president has done. And I'm a little concerned now that Democrats seem a little sheepish now about doing that which I think the House is called upon, which is its constitutional duty. You've got this report. You've got investigations that are underway. I think that there's the need to gather, I think, more information, and I think that impeachment ought to be, on the table. I don't say that right now. I don't think that, there ought to be a vote in the House of Representatives as to whether or not the president should be impeached. But I certainly think that investigations should occur. The information from the special counsel should be examined, and if that leads to impeachment, that should occur. The notion that we don't do this because it will have potentially a negative political consequence, from my perspective, is unacceptable.
Because of the accountability.
Because of the accountability. I mean, that's not the way in which our system of government is set up. If the OLC opinion is that we cannot indict a president, and then we're going to say, well, we can't impeach this president because of political considerations, that then makes this president, as we always say, and which we always abhor, puts him above the law. And that simply is inconsistent with the way in which our democracy is supposed to function.
You, as you mentioned in your tweet, said that any competent prosecutor could win an obstruction case.
And I think I had that capitalized.
I believe you did.
Right.
So make the case. What is the strongest evidence of the obstruction for you?
There are, I think, maybe 5 to 8. I mean, I have to look at it, but I think there's a solid 5 to 8 specifications. I mean, the interactions with McGahn, trying to do things with Sessions, trying to get at the special counsel, get at Bob Mueller. The testimony, the information that's contained in the report is actually pretty compelling.
And you appear in the report, by the way.
I was shocked to hear that, yeah.
And in the moment in which the president rails to Jeff Sessions that he has fucked his presidency,
right.
You
can say those kind of words on this kind of thing?
You can say that on podcast.
All right.
I'm quoting the president of the United States.
All right, this is good. All right.
And he says, "Why didn't you protect me in the way that Eric Holder protected Barack Obama?"
Yeah, right. All right. Eric Holder would not have done that. Donald J. Trump, don't think that if I were your attorney general, I would somehow throw myself in front of all these charges coming your way. I wouldn't have done that. But B, there was nothing to protect when it came to Barack Obama. Fundamentally different people, a person who's a constitutional scholar, a person who happens to be honest, a person who understands the separation of powers, understands the need for an independent Justice Department and for an independent Attorney General. I mean, he and I are friends, and there were things that happened in the Justice Department that I never shared with him or that he read about, in the newspapers. Quick example, when I made the determination not to defend the Defense of Marriage Act, this is when I thought, all right, this is huge. I don't want him to read about this in the newspapers. And so we were at, it was a Super Bowl party at the White House. This is kind of like a humble brag, And it was in the residence of the White House with the president. I do this all the time. And
defending the rights of LGBT people.
Yeah, and so it's the Sunday before. It's going to come out Monday. And I said, I got to tell him. He can't just read about this in the newspaper. So I said, Mr. President, I need to tell you something. And so I tell him, I've decided I'm not going to defend DOMA. And he said, oh, boy, I was trying to figure, this is him, I was trying to figure out a way in which I could tell you I didn't want you to defend DOMA. But he never did. He never did. And something as consequential as that, he understood the need for an independent Justice Department determination to be made by the people, men and women of the Department of Justice, and by his Attorney General, his friend. But we never talked about it until that Super Bowl Sunday.
Why did you make that decision not to defend DOMA?
Well, if you look at the history, the legislative history of DOMA, it is replete with really ugly, stereotypical, really anti-American kinds of things that really kind of generated the effort and really is the underpinning of the statute. And if you look at the history of LGBTQ people in this country, that is also a pretty ugly history. And I did not want my Justice Department, I did not want the Obama administration to be on record as supporting that kind of odious act. And I thought there was a legal basis, for us to make that determination, because we had, for the first time, because of some interesting legal stuff, we had an opportunity to look at the statute anew here in the Second Circuit, and made the determination that there was no basis to defend it. It's almost as if you're the Attorney General and it's 1954, and you're trying to decide what side you're going to be on, Brown or the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, and I wasn't going to be on the Board of Education side.
But as long as we are rehashing Obama-era decisions, one of the things, you mentioned accountability in this moment, and one of the criticisms of your Justice Department was the fact that...
Criticism of my Justice Department? This is clearly illegitimate.
It's of the President's Justice Department.
That would still be mine. But let's the hypothetical.
Let's walk down this hypothetical road together. Right. The idea that early on in the administration, you chose not to aggressively prosecute people for the crimes of the Bush era, both thinking about in the financial sector and in thinking about in the execution of the War on Terror. One of the lasting criticisms is that because there wasn't a moment of accountability for those things, it fed this culture of impunity in Washington that we're living in now. Yeah. How do you think about that? Why didn't you pursue?
All right, well, let's go back. I'll get back to that. But, this notion, I've heard this expressed a couple of times, that somehow or other the Obama administration, Barack Obama, is responsible for Donald Trump. It's kind of like, what? I mean, what alternative universe are people coming from when you reach that conclusion? That's kind of the conclusion. So let's go back to the beginning. People forget all the grief that I took when it came to reopening the investigations of people who were engaged in the use of these so-called enhanced interrogation techniques. I was reopening, that which had been settled, holders, gone off the rails. I took a lot of grief for that. But as we looked at the cases, impaneled a grand jury, appointed a person to, a very competent U.S. attorney to head the inquiry, we simply did not have the capacity to bring the cases, both because of the passage of time, but probably more importantly because the Justice Department, prior to mine, had issued these opinions that essentially said these enhanced interrogation techniques were consistent with American law, were consistent with international law. People acting under the guidance of those opinions out of the Justice Department, it'd be almost impossible to get into court and then to successfully prosecute them. But I have to tell you that we looked long and hard at those cases. And my hope would be that at some point, the grand jury proceedings, led by a guy named John Durham, I hope that those proceedings will become public at some point so that people will see what it is that we did, the lengths that we went to try to hold people accountable for things that were done that are inconsistent with who we say we are as Americans, inconsistent with our notion of ourselves as a people. The stuff was shocking. It was unacceptable. And the opinions of the Justice Department that enable that and the policymakers who enable that should be, they will not be treated kindly by history. Now, when it came to the bankers, I hear this all the time. Again, those are cases, these are career-defining cases, Preet Bharara here in New York, U.S. attorneys in other parts of the country where I farm those cases out. If they could have made cases against individuals, if you could have, the United States versus the, largest bank in the country, that CEO, that vice chairman, whatever. If you could have made those cases, we certainly would have made them. It wasn't like we didn't have the desire to make those cases. That kind of gets my back up a little bit, because it's like, well, wait a minute, you think I didn't make these cases? Why? Because I was in, the pocket of these people, because I didn't have the guts to try these cases. I pride myself on the fact that I've got a pretty high risk tolerance, that I had great people working for me, and the cases were simply we were simply unable to make them. I gave a speech at NYU as I was leaving the Justice Department, where I outlined a few things that needed to be done in order to make sure that we were not in the same kind of situation if there were another financial crisis.
And do you think? So I hear the point, right? That these are we went as far as we could get. Mm-hmm. Do you think that there is, setting aside the absurdity that Donald Trump is a consequence of anything that came before him other than white supremacy, but that there is, what do you think is the consequence for us, for our political culture, for the fact that those cases couldn't be made?
I'm not sure. Given the interest that has been generated, the revulsion that I think people felt because of the what happened with regard to the enhanced interrogation stuff, with regard to the financial cases, I think that people's consciousness has been raised, and I'm not sure that those decisions or lack of ability to bring those cases has had a huge impact, has made this a nation that is now filled with impunity, or that people now think there's a whole variety of things that they can do that they could not do before. I think those are aberrations, in a lot of ways. And I don't think, as I said, that what happened there led to, the bizarre things that this president does and the lack of accountability of with regard to this president. I think that is hopefully that is another aberration. I think that actually is something that gives me greater concern for the future of our democracy.
And what do we, and we're going to move on to elections after this, but what do we think about this idea? You are a person who has spent all of your adult life working inside a system, trying to make it work for the purpose of justice, trying to create social justice through law and order, through the federal government. And here we arrive at a moment where every apparatus of the federal government seems as though it's aligned against law and order and against justice. Do we take from that we cannot count on the institutions themselves? I'm groping around for how to ask this question, but many of us, myself included, have a lot of skepticism about the idea that the institutions that you have spent your life building can protect us from the evils of our society. Why should we have faith in these institutions?
Well, I'm not sure that our institutions have failed, which I think was kind of what you're going at. I don't think that our institutions have necessarily failed us. We're still in the middle. This is a movie that's going on. It's a 3-act play. I don't know. We're somewhere in the middle of this thing. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. The courts, I think, have done a good job. They've held, and there have been some rulings. A lot. This administration in court has an abysmal batting average. I mean, they go in there and get their heads handed to them like on almost a daily basis. So I think the courts have held. The career people in critical positions, I think, have done a good job in keeping the system on track. There's no question that the system and our institutions are being tested now. There's no question about that. And unless they are appropriately supported by people in leadership positions now, the systems could, I don't know if crack is the right word, but they could be irreparably harmed. And that's why I think the determinations that have to be made over the course of these next few months are really so very, very critical. We cannot have a situation where at the end of the day, a president of the United States is allowed to do the things, especially if you look at that obstruction component of the Mueller report, and not be held accountable. That simply is unacceptable. Now, exactly what form that accountability will take, be it impeachment and ultimately, a prosecution, something else. I mean, that has to occur. Something has to happen. We can't simply have that report, look at it, and say, "Wow, that was wrong. That was terrible," and that be the end.
Let's move on.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the state of our democracy. That's something that you are working on feverishly now. You have announced that you are not going to run for president.
Well, it depends on how this goes.
So,
No.
Would you like to announce something now? We'd be happy to make some room for that if you'd like to talk about that. Yeah.
That was not a great joke. No.
You be sure to call me should you change your mind and you need a
Absolutely.
place to talk about that. So you have instead taken on leadership of the National Democratic Redistricting Commission, where you are trying to do the work of fixing our gerrymandered congressional districts.
Right.
Can we start in 2010? 2010, I think, is an election that that we don't think enough about today.
The shellacking, as President Obama described.
As President Obama described it, it was a wave election for the Republican Party, but not just in Congress, at the state levels.
State level as well, yeah.
And as a consequence, what happened as a consequence of that election?
Well, it was a consequential election. You knew that at the time, but now looking back, 8 years now, 10 years, whatever it is, I mean, you realize how consequential that election was, because redistricting occurred in 2011. And the people who did the redistricting were the people who were elected in 2010. And you had Republicans taking over state legislatures all around the country and getting trifectas, which has meant the governor and then both houses of the state legislatures. And they used that power to gerrymander in a way that Princeton did a study that the worst gerrymandering of the past half century. Now, we've had gerrymandering in this country, I guess, almost since its beginnings. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to fix it, try to eliminate it. But what the Republicans did in 2011 was truly, truly breathtaking. And we've had to live with what they did in that partisan gerrymandering effort over the course of this last decade. And that was all fueled by the 2010 election.
They redrew 213 congressional districts, and some stats from what you wrote about in the Harvard Law Review, I believe it was, 2012, 1.4 million more votes for Democrats for Congress. Republicans won a 33-seat majority. 2016, a majority of votes for Democrats in Congress. Republicans won a 33-seat majority. And
it goes on. I mean, you look at 2018. Democrats had it was a wave election. If statisticians kind of look at those gerrymandered districts and say that Democrats should have gotten an additional 16 seats if the districts were drawn in a fair way, and Democrats should have flipped 7 state house chambers, but were unable to do so because of the way in which the lines were drawn in 2011.
So how do we fix this? I mean, I gather, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, so I gather part of the work that you're doing right now is just about targeting a certain set of districts and trying to flip those districts so that Democrats have control in those places when it's time to redistrict in 2020.
Yeah, I wouldn't say have control. I mean, our aim is to make sure that the process is a fair one. It is not an attempt to gerrymander for Democrats. I don't think we need to gerrymander for Democrats. If we just have a fair fight, that's all I want. Let's make this a fair fight. Make this a battle between conservatives, Republicans, Democrats, progressives. In a fair fight, Democrats and progressives will do just fine. We happen to have the people on our side. We're right on the issues. And if you allow people to be placed appropriately in districts, and if you don't do voter suppression, Democrats and progressives will do just fine. So this is not an attempt to necessarily get control, but it is an attempt to make sure that in one of those 3 places, governor, 2 state legislative bodies, that there is there's Democratic control there, so that there are Democrats at the table when it comes to the redistricting come 2021.
But what does the long-term fix then look like? If you say you just want to make it look fair, what does fair look like? How do I mean? So first off, I understand the court has already heard 2 cases.
Right.
Heard what they took 2 cases and heard it together, right? North Carolina and Georgia, on whether or not they're going to intervene in partisan gerrymandering. Are those cases a place to look for reform? Where's the long-term legal fix for this?
Yeah, well, we've tried to use a multi-pronged strategy. I mean, there's certainly litigation. The court's looking at North Carolina and Maryland. Maryland, Democrats gerrymandered a congressional seat. North Carolina, Republicans just went to town and they gerrymandered everything. They've gerrymandered everything. Mark Meadows, one of the heads of the Freedom Caucus, comes from one of the most gerrymandered districts in the country, as does Jim Jordan from Ohio. So what's the impact of gerrymandering? You got those 2 guys in Congress, head of the Freedom Caucus, and doing all the things that they do. They're apologists, for Trump. So think about that. There is that connection between gerrymandering and these 2 guys and all the other things that they have done. But we have this multi-pronged strategy. So we're going to bring lawsuits where we can on the basis of the Voting Rights Act if there's racial gerrymandering, but racial and partisan gerrymandering, we fight those. We support reform measures. We support efforts to let's take this out of the hands of politicians altogether. Let's have independent commissions actually draw the lines. They do it in Arizona. They do it in California quite successfully. We supported 5 states who had it on the ballot in 2018. And every time the people get the opportunity to vote for independent commissions, they vote for them overwhelmingly. So Missouri, Utah, Ohio, Michigan, Colorado, all of those states voted for it.
And so that's a universal fix to you, is if every state, it was an independent commission appointed by whoever state law says appoint, instead of having the legislature.
I actually think that's the best way. I think that's actually the best way to do it. So we file lawsuits, we support reform independent commissions, and then we also support direct electoral support. We'll support candidates for those critical redistricting positions who say that they will do redistricting in 2021 in a fair way. That means governors, sometimes it means secretaries of state. I was in Texas campaigning in 2018 where we picked up 12 House seats, state House seats. We need 9 more to take control of the Texas State House of Representatives. And if you do that, that would prevent the kind of excesses that you saw in 2011 in Texas.
Is there I often think about the sort of, when you take a step back from the immediate questions, the deeper question of how we got into, one of the ways we got into this in the first place is, of course, the legacy of Jim Crow. And there's this tension that I'd love to hear you tease out for me, is between the idea that in order to have black political power in a number of places, we need to have densely black political districts, which is a form of gerrymandering, versus in order to not have these skewed districts in the first place, we need to spread people out such that everybody has to represent a full slice of the electorate. Those do feel like ideas that are in conflict with each other. Setting aside the explicit partisan piece of it, those seems like they're in conflict with each other when we think about gerrymandering and drawing districts. And
I don't think there's quite the tension that you talk about. I mean, if you draw these districts in a fair way, and so that they are relatively compact, that they're contiguous, that they have bizarre shapes, so that they are contiguous, that they respect natural boundaries, and that they also take into consideration communities of interest. And you take those 4 factors to draw up district lines, you can come up with lines that are both fair and also are done in a way that's consistent with the Voting Rights Act, so that communities of color will have the ability to express themselves in ways that gerrymandering, as done by the Republicans in 2011, does not allow. Where they took advantage, took advantage of that which the Voting Rights Act says. You've got to have communities of color, give them the ability to express themselves politically. And so they pack, African Americans, Hispanics into districts, which decreases ultimately. So yes, you get a black legislator or congressman, but the reality is that you have these other districts that could be impacted if you drew the lines in a more fair way, could have a greater sensitivity to those, the interests of African Americans, of other people of color. They've done this very cynically, and hold themselves out as protectors of the Voting Rights Act. I mean, one of the arguments they're making now with regard to the census, which I guess we're going to talk about, is that Wilbur Ross said that Jeff Sessions told him that he needed to have this citizenship question on the census form so that Jeff Sessions could be more effective at enforcing the Voting Rights Act. Now, if you want to understand hypocrisy, there it is. I mean, that is whatever the definition is in Merriam-Webster now of hypocrisy, that needs to replace it. That's the most hypocritical, disingenuous thing I think I've ever heard.
And so the court is going to hear this case tomorrow.
Court hears the case hears tomorrow. The whole question of whether or not a citizenship question, are you a citizen of the United States, should be on the census. It has not been on the census since 1950. There's a whole variety of other information, other forms where you can get that information. The reality is, let's be just frank about this, the reality is this is an attempt by the Trump administration to have an undercount in certain communities. And let's be more frank, to have an undercount in immigrant communities. And let's be even more frank than that, to have an undercount in Hispanic communities. It's consistent with the fear that they have put out there, that they've tried to instill tried to wedge into the Hispanic community. And that's just another way in which they want to make sure that people, it's like, oh, no, I'm not going to raise my hand and be counted. And that has a huge impact on the apportionment that will happen, the redistricting that will happen in 2021. But it also has a lot to do with how $800 billion in federal money is doled out. Again, that's all done on the basis of the census.
What will you be listening for tomorrow on these arguments?
Justice Roberts, but this is one, this is really one where the court should rule 9-0. I mean, they really should. There are two bases for the suit. There's a constitutional argument, and there I can see how the courts, you might get a 5-4, something. I think we should win. But there's also a procedural basis, whether or not the Trump administration followed the Administrative Procedures Act. If you're in law school, this is the thing that puts you to sleep for 2 days while you're in admin law. But now I love the Administrative Procedures Act. It's a great statute. They didn't do any of the things that you were supposed to have done. You're supposed to test these things before you include a question, see what the impact of the question is going to be. One of the questions you're supposed to ask is, will it result in an undercount? They didn't do any of that stuff. And then you look at the emails between the Commerce Department and the Justice Department, and you're able to glean that this was something that was purely political, thought up by Bannon and by Chris Kobach.
So set the constitutional question aside is what you're really looking for. Let's
Yeah.
just talk about it procedurally.
Yeah, I mean, I think anything less than a 9-zip on the administrative procedures part on the would seem to me to be. I just don't see how you can do it. I mean, this is really kind of law school 101.
No. So speaking of Judge Roberts or Chief Justice Roberts, one of the big moments in history, and I can imagine in your life, was in 2013 when the Roberts Court ruled in Shelby County versus Eric Holder Jr. That
we just call that the Shelby County case. That's like you don't want your name on the Dred Scott case, I mean, so let's just we call it Dred Scott. Let's just call it Shelby County and forget the V Holder thing.
All right, well, so on Shelby,
there we go.
Where they essentially defanged the enforcement provisions of the Voting Rights Act.
Well, they gutted the Voting Rights Act. They gutted it.
Do you remember when you got that? Did you see it coming?
It was interesting. Don Verrilli was the Solicitor General, and I'm not naive, but I thought, given all that Congress had done, the hearings that they had held, the margins by which the Voting Rights Act had been renewed, the fact that it had been signed by a Republican president, and in fact, all of the renewals of the Voting Rights Act had been signed by Republican presidents. It just didn't seem to me that there was a basis to do what the court ultimately did. That is as ideological a decision as I think we've ever seen. And you could potentially have a real suite of cases here. Citizens United, going to let in all kinds of dark money. Shelby County, we're going to allow for the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, and that then spawns all these voter suppression measures. And then if you don't knock down this partisan gerrymandering, you would really, in those three cases, you would really have, I think, altered the arc of our democracy. And my hope would be that the Chief Justice, who is said to be an institutionalist, would understand the impact of those three cases. But I thought in the Shelby County case that Justice Ginsburg clearly had it right. He said if you're standing in a rainstorm with an umbrella over your head and you're not getting wet, that doesn't mean you should take down the umbrella, And that's exactly what happened. We took down the umbrella, and we got rained on with all of these voter suppression measures.
And has it been as bad as you expected, or have you been like, well, okay, we're hanging in there?
No, it's been bad. It's been extremely, extremely bad. And I think the courts have been, the lower courts have certainly, been, I think, amenable to the kinds of cases that have been brought. We were not left with no tools. You said Section 2 cases that could be brought, but they're more difficult to bring. And the Section 5, the genius of Section 5 was that in those covered states, before a jurisdiction could change the location of polling places or change the way in which candidates or whatever, you had to get them pre-cleared. And so you could stop things before they happened. Section 2, you can only bring cases after the vote has occurred. And that makes they're harder cases to prove, and the negative impact is already you're trying to undo something as opposed to preventing something with Section 5.
But thinking about this suite of cases that you laid out, I mean, there's the Voting Rights Act, and now we have Citizens United, and now we have this gerrymandering decision coming. Mm-hmm. One, are you hopeful on the gerrymandering decision that they will in fact act? And if they don't, where does that leave us with a court that's going to be the way it is for some time?
Yeah, I can't say that I'm optimistic about the gerrymandering case. I had a greater degree of optimism when Justice Kennedy was there, who at least had indicated that, you can go too far with partisan gerrymandering, but I'm not sure how do you draw the line? That's essentially what he said. Justice Kavanaugh said some positive things during the oral arguments of the partisan gerrymandering oral argument. And so we'll see, what he does. I think the other 4 justices were not likely to get, so it may rest on Kavanaugh. And I'm not sure that, again, he said things in oral argument
that led people to believe that he was considering.
Gives you some degree of hope. But here's the deal. My hope is that we win. My hope also is that if we don't win, they will do the least damage possible. Because one of the things that we have been doing now is to understand, all right, we're not likely to get a federal court, a United States Supreme Court determination that you can go too far when it comes to partisan gerrymandering. So let's look at the state constitutions, and let's look at the state Supreme Courts. The case was brought in Pennsylvania using the Pennsylvania state constitution. Pennsylvania Supreme Court said that the partisan gerrymandering there was inappropriate, and the congressional delegation went from 13 Republicans, 5 Democrats, to 9-9 as a result of the changes that were made there, and which is pretty much a 50-50 state. We have now filed a lawsuit in North Carolina, again, using the North Carolina state constitution, and that'll go before a North Carolina Supreme Court.
And this court overall, as we joke that we're waiting for Judge Kavanaugh on this opinion, we're looking at a court where Roberts and Kavanaugh are essentially the swing votes.
I mean, and that shows you how far right the court, has moved. I mean, the swing vote was Sandra Day O'Connor, then it was Anthony Kennedy, and now it's, I guess, Chief Justice Roberts. The swing keeps going further and further, to the right.
I mean, I guess this brings me back to what I was fishing for earlier around institutions and where we turn for help. I mean, I feel like there is amongst reform-minded people, liberals, progressives, however they identify, there's this look to the courts, there's this look to law to save us, and we're now looking at a Supreme Court that is not reform-minded.
Yeah.
And so where does, thinking as somebody who, as a prosecutor, as somebody who has sat inside these institutions, where do we turn? Has that been folly that we've put so much weight on the courts in the first place?
I don't think it's been folly, but I don't think that we have understood the history of the Supreme Court in a way that we should have. The Supreme Court has never, there's the Earl Warren period. And we think about that as defining the history, that as defining what the Supreme Court has always been. And the Supreme Court has always been a pretty conservative institution, maybe but for those years, but for the Warren years. I think we should do what we can in the courts. But at base, we have to win elections. We have to win elections. Progressives, Democrats need to win elections. And that's why I think this whole gerrymandering effort is so vitally important, because the reality is, if conservatives are in control of the courts, and they certainly are in control of the Supreme Court, the way to get control and push a progressive agenda is to control the state legislatures, which ultimately draw the lines for the United States House of Representatives, win Senate seats. The court's going to have the ability to make decisions on things other than legislation, but so much of what bedevils this nation, from my perspective, comes from what these legislatures are doing, and these heartbeat bills now, that are being passed, that are really attempts to just say that abortion should be illegal. That's the kind of thing where if you had a more representative state legislature, you wouldn't have to deal with that statute. That would not be a question that would ultimately have to be resolved by the Supreme Court. So we've got to get out there and do the blocking and tackling, the hard stuff of winning elections, but also winning elections, not just the presidency. Progressives, Democrats, we get all excited about who's running for president, and I'm the only Democrat who's not. You know, and that's
Again, this is an opportunity for you.
I'm not feeling this here, and so. And that's true. That's true. You know, this election, this presidential election coming up, is an existential one. Existential. We have to pick somebody who's going to win. You know, we have to win that election. But we can't do that at the expense of taking attention away from these state and local races, where on a day-to-day basis, people's lives are really more directly impacted. If you care about, you know, reproductive rights, if you care about expanding Medicaid and doing the appropriate thing with regard to health care, if you care about climate, if you care about voter suppression, criminal justice reform, almost all of that stuff is decided at the state level. And we as progressives, Democrats, have let the Republicans kind of have their way there. And that is one of the things that the NDRC is bound and determined to stop.
We have just a few minutes left. I know you have to catch a plane, so we will respect your time. The last thing I want to quickly ask you about is policing.
Yep.
There was, this weekend, we had yet another example of a viral video of a young black man, in this case a child, a 15-year-old boy, who police in Broward County slammed his head into the ground. He was unarmed. Your Justice Department prioritized consent decrees as a tool for police reform. Why was that an important tool? And how do you think about what you're seeing in the Trump Justice Department, where they have very explicitly stepped away from that?
Well, I thought those consent decrees were important because we try to deal with cultures that lead to those kinds of incidents. Certainly you want to hold individuals responsible for things that they might have done. Although even there, I said that the standard for federal involvement was too high and that we needed to lower the standard so that the federal government could bring charges in police misconduct cases. But consent decrees were important so that you look at a police department, like a state police department, local police department, and you change the way in which they operate. You give them appropriate training on the use of force, on implicit bias, you know, all of these things that everybody carries around with them, implicit bias at least. You know, I think to myself, one night, running to a movie in Georgetown, very nice part of Washington, D.C., running with my cousin. You know, we're late for a movie, always his fault. And police officer goes by in a car, shines a light on us and says, "Stop, where you going?" And my cousin, you know, so immediately I think to the talk I had with my father, just get out of this, just get out of this. My cousin, by contrast, starts to mouth off with the cop. And I'm thinking, well, all right, you know. And so I think about that incident, and I think about that cop seeing these two black guys running to a movie, thought something was amiss, not knowing that one of those two black guys, me, was a federal prosecutor, you know? And so you've got to deal with this whole question of implicit bias that, as I said, I think we all carry around, but it's particularly pernicious if it's held by people in law enforcement. The training on the use of force so that people in law enforcement understand that there are ways to diffuse situations without doing the kinds of things that we saw in that video. And then just building up the trust that has eroded or perhaps never existed in certain places between communities of color and people in law enforcement. All of that those are the ways in which we systemically we're trying to move the needle and try to improve the way policing was done in this country. And then the president had this 21st century task force on policing that I thought was, you know, making great strides. I thought we were doing appropriate things with consent decrees, and then Sessions comes in and says that he's doing, just not going to emphasize.
I mean, you couldn't have a more stark counterpoint between you and Jeff Sessions on this issue.
That would be right. New York, Alabama. My wife's from Alabama, so but yeah, let's just say that there's a stark contrast.
But what does that mean for the Justice Department long term? And so do you look, when you see what Jeff Sessions did and now what Bob Barr is doing, and thinking particularly about the Civil Rights Division, mm-hmm.
Do
you see that and say, wow, we did all that work and it's just like that taken apart? how big of a change institutionally is it?
No, there's no question that there has been a huge institutional change in emphasis and in the way in which the department has conducted itself in areas that I would consider critical to what a Justice Department's role should be. And there has been damage that has been done, but I don't think it's lasting damage. There's another reason why this election in 2020 is an existential one. A new attorney general can come in and reverse a great many of the things that, if not all of the things that Sessions and Barr have done, and put us back on the path that we had established during the Obama years. Again, that's why we've got to get out there. We've got to vote, got to fight voter suppression, have to elect, a Democrat, a progressive as the next president of the United States. And then that person's got to make a great selection to put somebody at the Justice Department who knows the department, who's got the guts to make changes, somebody who's going to go in there and not be hesitant to rip out the negative things that were done by the previous administration.
In our final minute, why are you not running for president?
Well, it's it's interesting. People you hear it all the time. People say it's a family decision, and when you think, oh yeah right. When you actually get to making that decision, you do have to really make it a family decision, and it's just not the right time for my family. And then I have the work I'm doing with NDRC. I was also concerned about leaving that almost in midstream, something that I consider extremely important to our democracy, and to leave it, in an attempt to become president, that gave me great concern. I will tell you, though, that be very honest with you, I thought that I had a shot. Now, every person who gets up in the morning, all of these 20 people get up in the morning, they look in the mirror and they see a president. That's.
I have never looked in the mirror and seen a president.
Well, I need 20 Americans who do. And I saw a path, but it just wasn't the right time.
But it doesn't sound like you precluded ever being the right time.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm a little old now. I think this was kind of my shot. I think I'll be a little on the elderly side next time.
I will beg to differ. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having
folks. Thanks to Eric Holder for joining us tonight. No, you'll go out last day.
So first off, my apologies. I hogged all the question time. I was gonna, but how many chances do I get to interview the Attorney General? So what we're gonna do now, as we wrap up, we're gonna do two things. One, we're gonna play the trailer for our podcast. It's about a minute and a half, I think, of listening. You'll enjoy it. And then after that, you all got a set of questions. Oh.
My plane's been delayed an hour, so.
Oh. Absolutely. Never mind what I said. All right, so.
What's up? Delta Airlines. I love Delta, but it's the weather. It's the weather.
it's the weather. Yes. Do we have? First off, make sure we have the ability to do this now.
Oh, I'm sorry.
All right. Excellent. So let's start in the back and work our way forward. And you'll just tell us. Well, we've got 15 minutes that we have the auditorium for.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
I'll pass it to you. Can you comment on the consolidation of media where the Fox Newses and the Sinclairs of the world are indistinguishable from the administration?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big concern. Again, we always need to be thinking about what are the pillars of our democracy, and this consolidation of media, these media conglomerates. Sinclair, even more bizarre than Fox, I think, that's a hell of a statement to make. People who get their, I saw something on the way up here. Some people get their news from Fox, dismiss, some like 63, 70% of them dismiss the Mueller report in its entirety, which shows the real concern. The impact of a media entity on our democracy. And so I think that we need to use all the tools that we have and upgrade the tools that we have. We try to really police this stuff using the Sherman Act, which is, I guess, from the early part of the 20th century. It's time for, I think, a revision of our antitrust laws so that we deal not only with, radio and television, but also to think about ways in which we look at these folks on the internet. And given all the, the way in which, my kids don't get their news from, Channel 4, 5, 7, whatever. Certainly from you.
Certainly from
you. But through the internet. Given what we have seen certainly with WikiLeaks and the 2016 election, there's, Republicans, that kind of just instinctively are against, government action. I think that there's a role for government to play, an enhanced role for government to play when it comes to antitrust and communications.
First of all, go Peglegs.
There we go. Stuyvesant High School.
One of the appeals of Donald Trump, I think, to a lot of people was that he was a disruptor. And you hear things from Pete Buttigieg about considered disruption. Do we need 50 states? Do we need the same number of representatives we have? Is this an appropriate time because people are antsy, and I think progressives are antsy the way that the right was antsy when Donald Trump was elected. Is this time for considered disruption about big questions, about realigning the country and its direction?
And can I add to that specifically? You have said that it's time to rethink the Electoral College.
Should be abolished. No question about that. But the likelihood that is going to happen is probably pretty small because you need, 3/4 of the states and all that. But there's this thing called the Interstate Compact that I think we're up to 180, 190 electoral votes now. States around the country are signing on and saying that what we're going to do with our electoral votes is cast them for the popular vote winner, not who won our state. And if you get enough states to get to 270, you can render the Electoral College meaningless.
I believe they're 80 some odd votes short.
Yeah, something like that. And these are not going to be easy votes necessarily to get, although it's interesting because I think you can look at the electoral map and come up with like 278 almost solid, pretty solid Democratic progressive votes. I happened to be looking at this when I was thinking about running for president. And
got a sense of the map.
Yeah. So you can get to 278, I think. And so I think that's one of the ways in which we should do it. But I also think we ought to be thinking about, abolishing the notion of life tenure for Supreme Court justices and federal judges. For an unelected person to sit on the Supreme Court for 30 years or so, 25 years, whatever, that's a long time for a man or a woman to be in a position of power like that without any kind of involvement with with the people. I'm not necessarily in favor of term limits when it comes to elected officials because you can always vote people out. But if you're on a court for 30 years, that's a little too much power. So that's another thing that I would look at. And I've also said that in reaction to what Mitch McConnell did with regard to Merrick Garland, that we need to think about expanding the court. We can't, again, fighting. Democrats, progressives need to fight. We got to get tough. I got a lot of grief when I said, when they go low, we kick them on. Maybe not. All right. So, but what I was trying to say there is that we don't do anything inappropriate. We certainly follow the law, follow the rules, the norms, but we got to be tough. This is not, as I was saying before, we have to win this election, and I don't want to come out of this next election thinking, well, we made a good fight and we followed principles and that was great, and Trump is still there. No, we have to win. We have to beat him.
Ultimately, it's a question of power in the end.
Right, and progressives need to be comfortable with acquiring power and using power. We've got to get to the point where that's an okay thing. We're gonna fight to get power. We're going to use power in appropriate ways. And if we're not comfortable with both the acquisition of it and the use of it, we're forever going to be bemoaning our fate. It's that's got to change. That's just simply got to change.
First, I would like to thank you for all of the information that you've been giving, and what I was telling my new friend was the ear candy that I came here for, which was to hear intelligent discourse about things that are very troubling and disturbing. So thank you so much.
I was surfing on Kai,
And thank you also for being a great interviewer. In the beginning of the interview, it occurred to me that what I was most worried about, something that occurred to me a few months back, was that we are living in a time where, for the first time in my life, we have the potential for a non-peaceful transition of power, which is just a very frightening thing that I think is an actual possibility for the first time ever occurring to me. And I would like to disclose that I'm one of those people who thinks that without Obama there wouldn't have been a Trump. But let me just put that in perspective.
But briefly, please.
God help us if there hadn't been Obama first. And I think my perspective on Trump is that he's merely a catalyst to exposing some vulnerabilities and perhaps a catalyst to some of the corrections that need to happen. I'm very appreciative of the information about voter registration and gerrymandering and that history lesson about 2010 and 11. There's actually a question here, which is what, now it evaporates from my head. I think that the coming election is one where we really do need to have a win, but I think that the thing that I was detecting in the early part of the interview was that you can't destroy the office while you're trying to make a correction on the individual. And so I think that what you've described is mostly the caretaking to preserve the presidency and the office, while still holding individuals who are bad actors accountable. And again, for that, I thank you. There was a question, but I forgot it. So.
That's okay. Thank you. But I'm sure you can respond to that.
No, but I think by holding Trump accountable, by holding this administration accountable, we will strengthen our institutions. We will strengthen the presidency. We will strengthen our democracy. The failure to hold him accountable, I think, will weaken this democracy. And, I don't necessarily think we're going to have a coup or anything like that, but our democracy can look fundamentally different, 5, 6, 7 years from now than it did before, where elections are, occur every 2 years, 4 years, but they could be rendered almost meaningless if gerrymandering is allowed to run rampant, if a lot of the things that, the Trump subordinates are allowed to put in place. I mean, our climate could be unalterably, could be on a path that we don't have the ability to alter. And then what kind of world do we leave to, to future generations? So there are all kinds of existential questions that have to be answered by us over the course of the next couple of years.
My question real quickly, I just remembered, was do you foresee, along with correcting the gerrymandering, a system where we vote differently? There was a program on WNYC about a week or two ago about the different ways that democracies do the counting and do recounting. And do you see any of that in our future, perhaps, a retweaking of?
Yeah, I've seen we have ranked voting and things of that nature. I'm not sure. I've seen that in certain states. I guess in certain localities they do that, but I'm not sure that we are wired that way. I think we tend to think of cast a ballot, count the votes, and then whoever gets the most votes. That's why I've said we're going to do away with the electoral college, and then if a person has not gotten over 50% of the vote 4 weeks after that we should have a runoff election, and so that way you would not have a splintering where somebody could become president and they'll have only 30% of the popular vote or something like that. So that's I need absolute power for about 24, 48 hours, and I could solve a lot of this stuff.
On this side. No one over here? All right. On this side? Back there? Nope. All right.
Hi. My question's about criminal justice reform. So you were very instrumental in shifting our Justice Department away from a tough on crime perspective to smart on crime. I was wondering what you kind of see as the next large-scale cultural shift that needs to take place to end mass incarceration. As, of course, there are a lot of really local shifts we can do, but on like a national or federal scale, what's the next frontier?
You know what? I think one of the things that has to happen is the damn Trump administration needs to get out of the way, because I think this is one of those rare bipartisan issues where conservatives, coming at it from different perspectives. Conservatives think, failed government programs. Progressives, there's a moral component to this. I remember having a meeting in the 5th floor of the Justice Department, my old office, coming into the conference room, and you had the Center for American Progress, the ACLU, meeting with representatives of the Tea Party and the Koch brothers to talk about criminal justice reform. I walked in there. Remember the bar scene from Star Wars? It was kind of like, And so I told my assistant, quick, get the DOJ photographer up here. I got to take this picture. And I said, let's take a picture. I stood in the middle, and nobody wanted to get close to one another. But I think that was a moment that we had. It's more than a moment, where the nation, Michelle Alexander, I think the great book that she wrote. There's academicians who have studied this. There is a feeling that our system is, out of whack. 5% of the world's population, 25% of all the people incarcerated on Earth are incarcerated here in the United States of America. We spend $80 billion a year on our incarceration system. But I think there's, that movement that, we did. There was that First Step Act, which was simply that, a first step. You need to have the second, third, fourth steps, and I think that would and could happen. But you've got components of the Trump administration. Sessions was a big impediment in that regard. With them gone, with a progressive president, a progressive administration, that is one of the places where I think you could actually have bipartisan action.
But in the current administration that we do have, so Sessions was the problem, but wasn't it the case that Bob Barr wrote?
Bill Barr.
I've been calling him Bob Barr all night. Bill Barr wrote a memo way back in the early 90s in making the case for mass incarceration.
Yeah, I'm going to say, that's why I said, it's this administration and this, more specifically, the leaders of this Justice Department that rolled back a lot of the smart on crime things that I put in place, that we put in place. And so, that path, we've taken a zig, but we can get back on that path with, a new administration.
We can get one more in. All right,
election hacking. All the work you're doing, but what's being done to prevent hacking?
Yeah. And that's a part of this whole thing that I don't think has gotten the necessary attention. And it's, this is a country that was attacked. We were attacked by a foreign power, attacked. And this administration has done nothing both to hold that foreign power accountable or done nothing to prevent the next attack, because they're coming back in addition to other countries. And, I think Trump feels that if he does anything to hold Russia accountable, it delegitimizes, his election, and that has put us in a position where we shouldn't be. Having experienced 2016, we ought to be in a much better position to be prepared for 2020, and we should have been for 2018. So I'm very worried about that. I'm very worried about not only what we saw with regard to the use of the internet to spread, false information, but ultimately with even more sophisticated tools. No indications of that yet, but is there a capacity to fool around with, purely electronic ballot voting machines? I worry about that. And the thing is, you don't actually almost have to even change the outcome of an election as much as to just bring questions into whether or not the election was conducted appropriately, whether it was legitimate, to have an impact on the ability of the United States to adequately respond.
I can't let you go without asking you about Stuyvesant Heights. As your alumni pointed out here, that you graduated from one of the more prestigious high schools in New York. We're having quite a debate here in the city now about the segregation of those elite schools. And I guess I just generally want to ask you to comment on it. I mean, how is that? Do you feel like that system is broken here? And if so, how could it be fixed?
Well, I mean, I think the best educations are the ones where the students are as diverse as is possible, because, education's not only what you're getting from the teacher, it's how you're interacting with your fellow students. And if you have, if you're excluding significant portions of, the people in this city, the young people in this city, the education is not as rich as it otherwise might be. Now, I understand the tradition and taking the test, and I took the test and, somehow got on the other side of it. And so I can see how that could be a component of it. But one of the things you might think about doing is have a bar and say that, I don't know, you've got to have 85 on it. I'm just picking a number, 85 get an 85 on the test. And then everybody who gets above an 85 would be eligible for, admission into one of the specialized schools. And then you make a determination as to who actually gets admitted by taking into consideration a whole range of things, extracurricular activities, income level. There's a whole range of things where you would not decrease the effectiveness of the schools, the reputations of the schools, the rigor of the schools. Because in some of the articles I've read, and you all have probably read more than I have on these things now, because I'm down in D.C., that kids who were admitted to Stuyvesant with some, not waivers necessarily, but through some alternative means, did just as well as people who had passed the test. And at the end of the day, that I think is the greatest. That's the marker. How do people do in the schools? If you come in a different way and you do as well as people who pass the test, well, maybe we ought to enhance that as an admission tool.
This time I really am going to say.
All right. Can I say that?
Yes.
All right. We've had a great conversation here. Kai, I want to thank you for inviting me. 30 seconds. We've talked a lot about the state of this country, the state of this democracy. One of the silver linings in the Trump cloud is that it has awakened people to the notion of their civic responsibility. And what I would urge all of you to do is to not only to come to events like this, and hopefully this has been something that's been meaningful that you have enjoyed, and maybe even lit a fire under you, but to get out there and to fight for this democracy, to fight for this country, to understand that if we're going to have a better America, it's going to depend on what it is that each and every one of you do. And every week, I always say, like on Sunday night, look back at the prior week and say, ask yourself, what have I done? What have I done to make this country better, more just, more fair? We have that capacity within ourselves. We have that ability. Dr. King said that the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. But that only happens when people like you put their hands on that arc and pull it towards justice. And so I would urge you all, find the way to move that arc towards justice. Let's go out there and change the world.
Thank you.
Okay?
On that note, we have producers here that are going to be outside with microphones. We're going to ask you to answer the questions on the cards we presented to you. Who in your life, anyone in your life, in your community, at your workplace, wherever, who's doing what Eric Holder just said do in your world that you know? Tell us who that person is and why they inspire you. And tell us what you think is the most urgent thing that we need to deal with as a society. And then the last thing that you need to do is pull out your phones on your way out of here, go to wherever you get your podcast, as we say in the business, and subscribe to The Stakes. Please, please, please. The first episode will drop tomorrow, and we want all of you in the conversation. And we're going to play the trailer on your way out, I was just told. Okay, so go ahead and then subscribe, answer those questions, and I'll keep talking to you.
I
had this thing as a kid where I like to complain to my grandmother about people. I'd say, Grandma, when I grow up, I'm going to live way off in the mountains, someplace where I don't have to deal with nobody, be a rugged individual and all that. And she'd just laugh and shake her head like this poor, naive child. We humans are stuck with each other, no getting around it. And we are constantly managing that reality, deciding how do we want to live together, and then coming up with rules and systems and cultural norms to enforce those decisions. And here's the deal. That means if we don't like the society we got now, we can design a whole new one. And actually, we have to.
If there is a book that you want to read but it hasn't been written yet, you must be the one to write it.
Because plainly, the old model isn't holding up. From WNYC Studios, welcome to The Stakes, a new podcast about change. How do we get here, and where are we going next? I'm Kai Wright. Join us as we look for answers.
So why do you think society wants to put people in boxes?
Why are we so angry?
Like, what do you mean when you say whiteness?
What happened?
Have you spent time thinking about what it must have been like to train 4,000 rats?
What the hell explains this dramatic reduction in violent crime?
What are you going to do with this?
The Stakes, a show about change. Subscribe to our newsletter at thestakespodcast.org and hit me up on Twitter at Kai_Wright. Join us.